Picture this: a 14-year-old girl stands before an altar, her hands trembling as she's about to marry the man who killed her father's soldiers and conquered her homeland. This isn't fiction. This is the real story of Anne of Brittany, and it's more dramatic than any Hollywood screenplay. The year is 1491. Europe is a chessboard where kingdoms rise and fall with each strategic marriage, each military campaign, each political alliance. In this world, young princesses are pawns traded like valuable commodities to secure peace or legitimize conquest. But Anne of Brittany would prove that even pawns can become queens, and sometimes queens can checkmate kings. Our story begins in the rugged peninsula of Brittany, jutting out into the Atlantic from what is now western France. But in the late 15th century, Brittany wasn't French at all. It was an independent duchy with its own language, customs, and fierce Celtic pride. The Bretons spoke their ancient tongue, governed themselves through their own parliament, and most importantly conducted their own foreign policy, often in direct opposition to French interests. Anne was born on January 25, 1476, in the castle of Nantes. Her father, Duke Francis II, was a master of political survival, constantly maneuvering between France and its enemies, England, Burgundy, and the rising power of Spain. Brittany's independence hung by a thread maintained only through Francis's clever alliance-building and the strategic value of Brittany's coastal position. When Anne was born, her father desperately hoped for a son. Medieval inheritance laws favored male heirs, and Francis knew that a daughter would make Brittany vulnerable. But as years passed and no son came, he realized his firstborn would inherit one of the most precarious thrones in Europe. So he did something revolutionary. For the time, he prepared his daughter to rule like a king. While other princesses learned needlework and music, Anne studied mathematics, law, and diplomacy. She became fluent in Breton, French, Latin, and Greek. She learned to read financial ledgers, understand military tactics, and navigate the treacherous waters of international politics. Her tutors described her as brilliant but stubborn, with a mind that cut through deception like a sword through silk. But intelligence alone wouldn't save Brittany from the storm that was coming. In 1483, King Louis XI of France died, leaving the throne to his 13-year-old son, Charles VIII. During Charles's minority, real power rested with his older sister, Anne of Brittany, who shared her father's obsession with bringing Brittany under French control. Duke Francis, sensing the approaching threat, made a desperate gamble. He arranged for Anne to marry Maximilian of Austria, the Holy Roman Emperor, and one of the few men in Europe powerful enough to protect Brittany from France. In December 1913-year-old Anne was married by proxy to the 31-year-old emperor. Maximilian wasn't present. Instead, an ambassador placed his leg in the marriage bed next to the young bride, a medieval ritual symbolizing consummation without the act itself. This marriage was the spark that ignited a war. For France, the union of Brittany with the Habsburg Empire represented a strategic nightmare, enemies to the east, and now potentially to the west as well. Charles VIII declared the marriage invalid and invaded Brittany with overwhelming force. The Breton army, brave but outnumbered, was crushed in a series of battles. Duke Francis, already ill and broken by the stress of seeing his life's work crumble, died just weeks after the final defeat. At 14, Anne found herself an orphan, a widow, in all but name, since her marriage had never been consummated, and the Duchess of a conquered territory. French forces surrounded the castle of Rennes, where Anne had taken refuge. Supplies dwindled as winter approached. Her supposed husband Maximilian was fighting wars in Eastern Europe and could send nothing but empty promises. England was consumed by its own internal conflicts. Anne was utterly alone. It was then that Charles VIII made his shocking proposal. Anne must annul her unconsummated marriage to Maximilian and marry him instead, the very man who had destroyed her family and conquered her homeland. The alternative was trial for treason, for marrying an enemy of France, followed by execution and the complete annexation of Brittany with no guarantees of autonomy. Imagine the psychological torture of this moment. A teenage girl, having watched her world burn, was being asked to take the hand of the man who lit the match. Yet Anne, drawing on the steely determination her father had cultivated, saw an opportunity within the nightmare. If she had to surrender, she would negotiate the terms of her surrender. On December 6, 1491, in the castle of Langeais, Anne of Brittany married Charles VIII of France. The marriage contract was a masterpiece of legal duplicity. It proclaimed the union of the two crowns, while theoretically guaranteeing Breton autonomy. More crucially, it contained a clause that would define Anne's future if Charles died without. Heirs Anne would be required to marry his successor, ensuring Brittany could never truly break free from France. The wedding was described by witnesses as funeral-like in its solemnity. Anne remained silent throughout the ceremony and the banquet that followed. That night, alone in her chambers, she wept not as a bride, but as a mourner for her lost independence. But grief would soon transform into strategy. Anne arrived at the French court in Paris to face open hostility. She was seen as the rebel duchess, a foreigner forced upon the throne. The court was dominated by Anne of Beaujeu, Charles's sister, who had orchestrated the conquest of Brittany and viewed the new queen with undisguised contempt. Rather than fight this hostility directly, Anne began a subtle campaign to win over her husband. She used her superior education to impress Charles, who was notably less learned than his teenage bride. She identified his interests, particularly his growing fascination with Italian culture and his dreams of conquering Naples, and made herself indispensable as an advisor. Gradually, Charles began consulting his young wife on matters of state. When he embarked on his disastrous Italian campaign in 1494, it was Anne who organized the regency, in his absence consolidating her position at court while he was away. The transformation in her status was remarkable. Diplomatic. Reports from this period show a progression from describing her as a captive trophy to recognizing her as the true political mind behind the throne. Anne's relationship with Charles evolved from hatred to something more complex. He wasn't the monster she had initially imagined. Though physically unprepossessing and intellectually limited, he showed genuine admiration for her intelligence and treated her with growing respect. When Anne became pregnant in 1495, giving birth to a son who tragically lived only 3 weeks, the shared grief seemed to create a genuine bond between them. Over the next 3 years, Anne would suffer 2 more pregnancy losses. Each loss was devastating, but she never allowed personal grief to overshadow her political duties. She used her position as queen to protect Breton interests, appointing loyal officials to key positions in the duchy and ensuring that the autonomy promised in her marriage contract was respected in practice. This delicate balance was shattered. On April 7, 1498, when Charles accidentally struck his head on a low doorway while heading to watch a tennis match. He collapsed hours later and died without regaining consciousness, apparently from a brain hemorrhage. He was just 27 years old. Charles's sudden death transformed Anne's position overnight. At 21, she was no longer Queen of France, but remained the sovereign Duchess of Brittany. According to her marriage contract, the union between France and Brittany was technically dissolved. Anne immediately returned to Nantes, resuming her role as an independent ruler. For 9 months, Anne governed Brittany with the autonomy she had always desired. She reversed many French-imposed policies and reaffirmed alliances with England and Spain. But this window of restored independence would be brief. The new King of France, Louis XII, Charles's cousin, was determined to keep Brittany within the French orbit. But his approach would be radically different from his predecessors. Louis was a complex man, physically imposing and militarily Competent, but also known for his love of the arts and rare political pragmatism. More importantly, he had been unhappily married for 22 years to Joan of France, a union imposed on him for political reasons. Seeing in Anne both a personal and political opportunity, Louis quickly petitioned Pope Alexander VI for an annulment of his marriage to Joan, ironically using the same arguments of non-consummation and coercion that had been used to invalidate Anne's first marriage to Maximilian. Simultaneously, Louis sent envoys to Anne with a surprising proposal. She should become Queen of France again through marriage to him, but this time under terms radically more favorable to Breton independence. The new contract would explicitly recognize Anne's sovereignty over Brittany, allowing her to govern the duchy directly and maintain a separate administration. Most impressively, Louis offered to include a clause establishing that Brittany would only be incorporated into France if the couple had children together. Otherwise, the duchy would return to independent Breton lineage upon Anne's death. For Anne, the proposal presented profound dilemmas. Marrying Louis meant returning to the French court that had previously humiliated her. Yet the terms offered were infinitely more respectful of Breton autonomy than any previous agreement. After weeks of intense negotiations, during which Anne extracted even more concessions, the agreement was finalized. On January 8, 1499, Anne of Brittany married Louis XII, becoming the only woman in history to be Queen of France, twice consecutively with different husbands. The ceremony in Nantes was deliberately organized to contrast with her first forced marriage. This time, Anne appeared radiant in an elaborate gown of black and gold Breton colors, surrounded by her own nobility. The symbolism was clear. This was not the marriage of a defeated princess, but the alliance of two equal sovereigns. Anne's second reign as Queen of France would be radically different from her first. Louis, 15 years her senior, treated her with public deference and private affection that appeared genuine. Court chroniclers noted that the king frequently introduced his official declarations with the phrase, "The Queen, my wife, and I have decided," a formula that explicitly acknowledged Anne's role in royal decisions. During these years, Anne established at Blois what would become the epicenter of the nascent French Renaissance. As a patron of artists and writers, she commissioned translations of Italian classical texts, financed innovative artists, and transformed French court etiquette, introducing refinements that would become standard for generations. More importantly, Anne exercised concrete political influence. By 1505, she was widely recognized as the king's principal advisor, with foreign ambassadors frequently seeking her intercession in sensitive diplomatic matters. Her exceptional education and natural intelligence made her a formidable negotiator, a talent she used primarily to promote peace, in contrast to the warlike tendencies of most monarchs of the era. This period of influence and stability was marked by only one persistent shadow: the question of succession. Despite multiple pregnancies, Anne had only one child who survived to adulthood, Claude of France, born on October 14, 1500. The daughter, who unfortunately inherited her mother's slight limp, became the center of dynastic attention. The absence of a male heir created a significant dilemma. According to the terms of the marriage contract, Brittany would remain independent if Anne had no children with Louis. But Claude's existence complicated the legal situation. Anne, always thinking of Breton interests, developed a plan to guarantee her duchy's continued independence. She proposed marrying Claude to young Charles of Habsburg, the future Emperor Charles V and grandson of her first husband by proxy, Maximilian. This union would have effectively transferred Brittany to the Habsburg orbit, permanently removing it from French control. Louis, though generally deferential to Anne's wishes, firmly opposed this plan, insisting that Claude should marry Francis of Angoulême, his distant cousin and heir, presumptive to the French throne. The impasse over Claude's future would be the only significant source of conflict in Anne and Louise's marriage. For years, the question remained unresolved, with Anne refusing to yield and Louis avoiding imposing his will against his wife's explicit wishes. The dispute would only be resolved after Anne's death. In 1511, after 12 years of relatively happy marriage, Anne's health began to deteriorate. She suffered from kidney stones, an extremely painful condition for which medieval medicine offered no effective treatment. Over the next 2 years, her condition gradually worsened, with episodes of intense pain alternating with periods of temporary improvement. Even as her health failed, Anne remained politically active. In 1512, when Louis embarked on another military campaign in Italy, she again assumed the regency, effectively governing both France and Brittany. During this period, she negotiated trade treaties with England and mediated territorial disputes with Spain, demonstrating that her political capacity remained intact despite her physical suffering. In December 1513, Anne contracted gout, further complicating her already fragile condition. In the early morning of January 9, 1514, after a night of excruciating pain, she asked to receive the last sacraments. Her final words, directed to the Breton ladies who had remained in her service since childhood, were recorded by a witness: "Remember who I was, and who I never ceased to be, regardless of the crown I wore." She died hours later, at 36 years old. Anne's funeral was an extraordinary event extending over 40 days, combining French and Breton rituals. Her body was embalmed and carried in solemn procession from Blois to Saint-Denis, the French royal necropolis. Her heart, however, was removed and transported separately to Nantes, where it was buried in her parents' tomb, a powerful symbol of her divided loyalty between the crown she accepted and the land she never abandoned. Anne's death set in motion the events she most feared. Just 9 months after her death, Louis forced Claude's marriage to Francis of Angoulême against Anne's explicit wishes. When Louis died on January 1, 1515, Francis ascended the throne as Francis I, quickly consolidating French control over Brittany and effectively ending the independence Anne had fought so hard to preserve. The formal incorporation of Brittany into France would be finalized in 1532 through the so-called Edict of Union. Ironically, the document was signed by Claude's son, the future Henry II, sealing the fate his grandmother had desperately tried to prevent. Anne of Brittany's legacy is profoundly paradoxical. On one hand, she failed in her fundamental objective of preserving Breton independence. On the other, during her lifetime, she achieved what seemed impossible, transforming a catastrophic defeat into a position of extraordinary power and influence. As a duchess forced to marry her homeland's conqueror, she managed to negotiate terms that preserved at least nominal autonomy for Brittany for more than a generation. As a queen imposed upon France, she became one of the country's most respected and influential monarchs. Anne's mark on French culture is surprisingly enduring. Her artistic patronage helped establish the foundations of the French Renaissance. Her innovations in court etiquette persisted for centuries. She was the first French queen to have her own retinue of noble ladies in waiting, establishing a practice that would continue until the French Revolution. In Brittany, Anne is remembered with a reverence that borders on the mythical. Breton folk songs still lament the Duchess, who married death itself to protect her people. Statues of her adorn squares in Nantes and Rennes, and her emblem, the white ermine, remains a beloved symbol of Breton identity. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her story is how it transcends the typical narrative of the political princess reduced to a pawn in the masculine dynastic game. Though initially a victim of brutal circumstances, Anne refused to accept a passive role. She transformed every defeat into opportunity, every humiliation into leverage for future negotiations. The story of Anne of Brittany reminds us that even In the most oppressive circumstances of the past, human agency found ways to express itself. Forced to marry the man who destroyed her family and conquered her nation, she managed through intelligence, determination, and strategic adaptability to transform herself from victim into one of the most powerful figures of her era. The Duchess, who silently entered the chapel of Langeais as a forced bride, emerged in history as a ruler whose influence would endure far beyond her brief life. The man who forced her to marry him, expecting to absorb her inheritance and erase her identity, ended up eclipsed by her in historical memory. Today, Charles VIII is frequently remembered primarily as Anne of Brittany's first husband. In her tomb at Saint-Denis, Anne is represented twice, once as Queen of France, with crown and scepter, and again as Duchess of Brittany with the ducal mantle and Breton shield. This double representation perfectly captures the duality that defined her life. The princess, who forced to surrender to her conqueror, ended up conquering him in turn, never abandoning the identity they tried to tear from her. As her own motto declared until the end, non mudera, I will not change.